So I do a test at 4 weeks, and sorry, I had to restart the video. And if you feel at that point in time the course is not for you, that is, it gives you an opportunity to get out, but I don't think you will. The history of the Middle East is a interesting history. It really is the foundation of almost all history in terms of what we know as history. And what I mean by that is it has shaped the world culturally. It has been the conduit for trade and the exchange of ideas. So it's very important. So what I'm going to do first is kind of why we're going to study this, what it's about, and then we'll move into kind of the chapter 1, chapter 2 that you should have read. I know you haven't, but because you don't have the books yet. But when you do, the book is pretty good. You know, so I'm not a big textbook guy. I'll deviate from it from time to time, but this is pretty readable. It's not too bad in terms of a history book. So, why is it important? Of course, it's the old-fashioned way. All right. First, what is the Middle East? It's not a defined geographical region, and I'll show you. You saw in the video that it's a term that was made up in the 19th century that basically by an English guy that said, well, it's this area that is between the Far East and the Near East. But in the history of the Middle East, that geographic area has changed through history. So it's not just, it's very easy to say North America or South America or Europe, okay, things like that, or Asia. But the Middle East is kind of this amalgamous middle place that sometimes incorporates all of North Africa, sometimes it's just the Arabian Peninsula and the countries that touch the Arabian Peninsula. Sometimes it goes all the way into the Caucasus and to Eastern Europe. So it is something that as the history of this region has come about, the influences of non-geographical things like religion have shaped what's included in the Middle East. So we'll talk about that. But it's had many names. It's been called the Near East. It's been called Southeast Asia. It's not defined by the birth of one culture. There have been many cultures that have come from the Middle East. In fact, again, many people call Africa the birthplace of man and the birthplace of humanity. Really and truly, I would defend that it's not Africa that's the birthplace of man and history. It's really the Middle East, because parts of the Middle East count, in terms of North Africa. But because of the cultural impact of three of the largest religions in our world come from this area, it's hard not to take the Middle East as the great shaper of modern history. Okay, so that's one of the things that makes the Middle East unique. Also makes it a powder keg, because when you get religion mixed into anything, people get very passionate about it. And so that's why peace in the Middle East is such a hard thing, because it's not just, well, if we just figure out the borders, or if we can just, all just get along. There's so many things that get tied back to the emotion of religion that the Middle East is a very, very important place. Again, the Middle East is a term that was coined in the 1950s, and it was really trying to coin a term in an area prior to World War I that defined the area between Europe as a growing superpower and the rest of the world, and the Asia, which was really waning at this time as a power. So it was that in between, and so they called it, well, it's not all the way Asia, it's not Europe. What's in the middle, call it the Middle East. Okay. What's in a name? So in 1850, the name was based on a location, and it was part of colonial holdings. At the time, in the 1800s, if you've studied European history, and if you've studied, I actually teach a course in African nationalism, the 1850s, or the middle 1800s, was really known as the Scramble for Europe. The Scramble for Africa. They were carving up Africa in a major way. Well, of course, this is part of the Middle East was very close geographically to Africa, and so it kind of came out of colonial terms and colonial holdings. Also, this was a key trade route between Europe and Asia during the 1800s, and also prior to that. So this is where that name came about. By World War I, it was known as a strategic position between the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean, because this was an area that was obviously controlled by which empire? Ottoman Empire. Okay, so that is an area that was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. It was also known as the sick man of Europe. Okay, because at the time it was considered a European power, but it was also this strange, different culture that didn't match any other European culture, and so the Europeans started to define the region because they could see that the sick man of Europe was probably not going to make it through the war. And they had to give it a name. And what do you do with all these different ethnic groups, religious groups, and natural resources that are starting to be found in this, what was considered mostly a desert and useless area of the world? It really wasn't. It was a blossoming region that needed to have a name, and so that's why they came up with the Middle East. Today, the Middle East is very much so defined by the growth of Islam. Okay? When you think Middle East, you think of pretty much two things. You either think of the Arab-Israeli conflict and peace in the Middle East, okay, that term, or you think of Islam and the history of Islam. The other thing you think of is natural resources, specifically which resource?
Oil.
Exactly. Oil. Oil and natural gas is the number one resource in the area, and so it has begun to define that the OPEC countries, the countries that have oil, some of which aren't necessarily in the historic Middle East, but in the present-day concept of the Middle East. And also the Middle East, the geographic region has grown by also the spread of Islam. There's kind of a core area of northern Africa, even all the way over to Spain, because that was controlled at one point in time by the Ottomans, that many consider part of the Middle East, even though Spain is part of Europe. It's because of the influence of Islam in that country and its history. Okay, so it's one of the interesting parts. When you talk about Europe, it's very defined. You think of Western civilization, very defined. Okay, has a very singular position in history, dating back to the Greeks and the Romans, and then the medieval times, and then the Industrial Revolution, Western. Okay, then you have the other major cultural divide in our world, which is the Eastern, and the Japan and China and everything that is considered Asian. Okay, or the Eastern cultures. The Middle East is different because it's the crossroads between West and East. So in a way, it has characteristics of both, yet nothing that is quintessentially its own except for Islam. And so that's why in today's term, many people see the Middle East through the lens of Islam. And now, unfortunately, they also see it through the lens of what? You think of Islam, you think of the Middle East, what naturally comes to mind as, let's say, in America? Terrorism. Now, does that mean that the Middle East is defined by terrorism? By no means. Lots of great people there, lots of great culture there. But when you talk about the history of this region, you would be naive not to look through the lens of current conditions and see the growth of a certain form of terrorism in our world that we see almost daily now in the news. And it emanates from this region of the world based in its connection to extreme Islam. Now, let's get something out of the way. All religions have an extreme arm. There are extreme Christians. I don't know that there are extreme Buddhists, because they're just very peaceful people. But there are always extremists or zealots in any religion. So I'm by no means endowing Islam, but that is a certain construct that we live in terms of understanding this region and how it's impacted modern history. Okay, anyone who doesn't naturally think of terrorism when we talk about the Middle East doesn't or hasn't been watching history or hasn't been watching the TV for the last 20 years. You know, so it is something we will talk about. So again, originally this was considered the Middle East. This is what he was talking about when he talked about the Middle East. It was the Arabian Peninsula, the Straits, the Suez Canal, and the Straits of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf, and the opening to the Indian Ocean. This was considered the Middle East because simply this was the connection to Europe and the conduit for trade and the conduit for expansion. Okay, a whole lot easier to get through here than go around the Horn of Africa. So this is why this was called the Middle East. Today, we see the Middle East more as this greater area that has expanded with the expansion of Islam. In our minds, you don't just think of this as the Middle East. You probably, maybe not so much Northern Africa, but you definitely get this more, Turkey and further up into the Caucasus, the Afghanistan, Iran, much further over here away from the Arabian Peninsula than was originally considered. Okay. Why do we care about the Middle East? There's two areas that I want to talk about. One are the tangible reasons. The tangible reasons, obviously oil. Now, I won't say that. I'm not as progressive as anyone, but I am as innovative and forward-thinking. And I think that's a term that gets misused when you think of progressive or progressivism. I think forward. I do hope that we get to a day and age where we are not dependent on oil. Okay, now it may not be for the same reasons. Some people will say, well, it's because global warming and all those kinds of things. Okay, well, that's not going to happen in my life. It may not happen in my kid's life. I'd rather get off oil because it's expensive. I would love to come up with a version of energy that can put in my car and not spend over $2 a gallon.
Well, in South America, they have come up with an engine that runs off of water, but the United States government won't allow it because you spend so much money on it every day. Why would they take away their best money maker?
It's a big section of our economy. Now, I couldn't agree with you more. There are ways around it. There are ways around oil. But oil, although it's an awesome natural resource and it's the single greatest money maker in the Middle East, or most Middle Eastern countries, it's not just the people in the Middle East who are making money off of it. A lot of Americans making money off of it, or Europeans making money off of it. Billions and billions and trillions of dollars are made in oil, and so those people don't want to see oil stop. So the whole idea, and that's where you have to, where the lines blur between what's innovative and best and what's practical. Okay? What's innovative and best is that we all go to engines that run on water. Heck yeah. But if that happens, all I need to do is buy one car with that engine in it. And I'm set. Unless it breaks, you can fix it, but it's still a lot cheaper because water's cheap. Look at your power bill. The water part is the cheapest part. Now, cheap for us. But what if we really went to something like that? This is a tangent here, but what if we really went to something like that?
That'd probably be, if there was a dry spell like there was like 2000, then you would have people that would say it's a bad idea because then you're using water for different reasons than what they're used to.
Yeah, do you have enough water for crops? Do you have enough water? I mean, we can't feed all the people that are on the planet right now based on what the earth produces. Now, part of that's because we're not just giving it away, but there are people in Africa that are starving, and people around the world that are starving, and people here in the United States that are starving. Okay? And can we make enough and feed them all? Sure, we can if we just build it out and nobody wanted to worry about making money. Okay? We can only do that now because we have irrigation and the way of using water to do that. If you were to take all of the billions of barrels of oil and make them billions of barrels of water, the earth might run out of water. Because it's not, I'm sure it's not running on salt water. Salt water tears everything up. You ever been to the beach? Take a chair, leave it. It doesn't last too long before it starts rusting. It's salt. It's not sand, it's salt. Okay? So, and desalinization is not an easy process. So it's fresh water that's got to run on it. It's a limited supply of fresh water on the earth. So as cost efficient as it would be, is it practical to go to a water engine? See, there's a balance between that. Anytime someone tells you, and this is me included, so feel free to call me on this if I say anything over the next 15 weeks or 14 weeks. How many do we have left?
15.
Okay, 15 weeks that say this is the way, the only way, and the truth. If anybody ever tells you that, be very suspect. Because there's always two sides to every coin. There's always two sides to every argument. You'll find in my class when I ask you to do papers, or I ask you to write, or I even ask you to answer questions. Okay? The final paper that you'll do is something that will be about the future of the Middle East. I want you to look at what we've studied, and by the end of class, I want you, whether you're saying, what's the future economically for the Middle East? Independence on oil. There will be a day where we no longer use oil. It won't be in my lifetime, probably won't be in your lifetime. Okay? But someday, because of the rate of technology, solar, all these other powers, there's probably others out there that we haven't even discovered yet. Eventually we'll come up with something, and I don't think it's going to be water, because it's, again, finite in its quantity. I think more than likely it will be solar, because that's an energy source that won't run out until it gives out. And once it gives out, we're done anyway, so it doesn't matter. Right? But we're not there yet. There will be something that takes the place of oil. Right now, you go to any of the powers that control the Middle East, and they have lots of money, all based in oil. They have to be doing something as part two, the next phase, or they won't be in power, they won't have money, they won't be able to stay in control. Okay, so that may be what you want to write on. What's the future of the Middle East beyond that? Another may be, what's the role or the future of Islam between terrorism and radical Islam and regular Islam? You know, the battle is being waged between, you know, and what causes it and how do you address it? You know, some people say, well, it's all about jobs. There's part of that I believe. I think any group can be radicalized if they're marginalized. If they don't have enough money to put food on the table, then they will be ripe for the picking for someone to say, well, hey, come over here. What do you think causes gangs in the worst parts of America? Any idea? Why would you join a gang in America? It's the land of the free. Free education, free opportunity. Why would anybody want to join a gang?
They're probably lacking in something, and then the gang has it, and they're like, well, if you come do this, then we'll give you that.
Exactly. So whether you're in Chicago or Thomasville, if you don't think there are gangs in Thomasville, then open your eyes. They're everywhere. Okay. Now they may not be the same as in Chicago, but there's always groups of people that are marginalized, and they tend to group together and they say, well, because you're disenfranchised, because you've been marginalized, no one loves you out there, we'll love you. And it may be an abusive, weird love, but we'll let you fit in. Okay? But you just gotta sell drugs at the same time. Because you gotta help us pay for things, right? Okay? There's ways of getting people to be a part of it, okay? Well, that happens, I think, also in religions. People get marginalized in that religion, and so then people flip the script and they use the tenements of the religion also against your economic state. If you're poor and down and out of luck, and I come to you and say, hey, come join us and I'll make you master of your own domain. I'll give you power that you've never had before. Sounds pretty good, right? So I'll join in. It's the same game mentality. So what do? What can you do? That may be something you want to write about. Okay, so in my class, I want you to think for yourself. I want you to come up with an argument. I want you to come up with a stance. And I want you to be able to defend it. Now, some things that I ask on a test, well, it's going to be straightforward. What were the three major civilizations, that came out of the Middle East? Pretty straightforward, that kind of thing. Or define out the empire's role. That's fact stuff. Yeah, we're going to do some of that. But when I ask you to defend something or make a case, that's where you get a little bit of free reign to do your research and make a case. It may be absolutely opposite of what I think. I won't hold it against you. Okay? I will not hold it against you and say, "No, I don't think that way. Mr. Henson, you failed my class." I'm not going to do that. As long as you can make a good argument. Okay? As long as you put some effort behind it. It can't be just because. Or because you said so. You got to say, "Well, I think it's because," and here's my thoughts. Here's why. Here's what I looked up. I'm impressed. I say, "Hey, I hadn't thought that way." Okay? If you can defend your argument, then that's one thing. So I got a little bit tangent, but that's part of the paper that we're going to do, the last project. So natural resource, that is a huge, tangible, oil drives the economy around the world, not just our economy, but Europe's economy, Russia's economy, because they're kind of European, but not, and definitely the Middle Eastern economies. Another tangible, terrorism, radical Islamic fundamentalism. That drive what's happening, why we study it. It's important to understand, what did that grow out of? Why did it radicalize? Why is it such a big issue right now all over the world? Why are they bombing, or why are they getting in cars and trying to run over people? Why? That's important to study. It's just not because they just don't like people. There's a reason behind it. We may not understand it, but that's why we study history. Why do we study it as Americans? We should study because we have an alliance with Israel. Whatever your political predisposition is, the current political situation is that we are an ally of Israel. So we should study the history of the Middle East because that's a big piece of our foreign policy right now. Whether it should stay the same or change, that will be driven by future leaders of our country. So it's important that we stay because we have alliances here. We also have alliances with European countries. Turkey is part of the Middle East, but it's also part of Europe. And then the final one, why should we study them? There are rogue countries that want nuclear power and have nuclear ambitions. You talk about Iran. The Iranian deal, whether you think it's a good deal, a bad deal, or how we should engage, and all of those situations, that's important. Anybody who's got a nuke should be paid attention to. Okay? Those are tangible things. There are also intangible reasons. Okay? Intangible, religious reasons. We study the history of the Middle East because if you prescribe to any of the three major religions that are listed here, you can't help but study it. Even if you're just studying it through the Bible, through the Torah, or through the Quran, you're going to study Middle Eastern history from maybe a religious standpoint. But it's intangible because it links us back to the origin, to the origination of the religion. Okay? And so we study it. The spread of faith. Today, the fastest growing religion in the world is what? Islam. It's not Christianity. Christianity had its time and day as being the fastest. Okay? But today, it's Islam. And that doesn't mean 100 years from now it won't be Christianity again. 100 years from now it may be Judaism. It may be Hinduism. It may be Buddhism. But today, it's Islam. Okay? And so that's an intangible reason to study the spread of the faith. Christians are studying why it's spreading so fast because they want it to spread as fast as Islam is. And it did at one time. So we study that because numbers matter. And they just do. So there's also an intangible reason to study this in terms of our Israeli alliance. Depending on your religious faith, you may say, you sure need to back Israel no matter what. God chooses people. God doesn't choose people, then unchoose them, right? So, maybe that's why we do it. Maybe because of our Judeo-Christian background, our country has done it. I don't know. But it's tangible in terms of it's the only democracy in the Middle East. Only true democracy. Egypt, kinda, but really and truly, Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. Okay? The intangible is, well, they're a partner, and based on our historical faith as a country, we're aligned with them kind of spiritually and politically. Okay? And I'll leave this one last to pull up, but truly we study it. It's intangible, but prophecy. Okay? The end of times is kind of spoken about in all three of these major religions. And so if you ascribe to any of them, you kind of pay attention. Has anybody heard of Megiddo? Megiddo is a place that's in the Middle East, and in the Judeo-Christian background, this is where the last battle will take place. And it's kind of getting into biblical history. But again, we're going to talk about, King David and his kingdom. That's in history. It's not just in the Bible. And we've all heard of Goliath and all that, right? David, yeah. He was a real king. He had a kingdom. He ruled over it. Okay? That's in history. Whether you believe in Christianity or not, that happened in history. And so it's easy for people to say, well, it's not going to happen. Revelations and stuff. But a lot of stuff in the Bible has happened in history. So it's studied for intangible reasons because people look at it as a sign. There were people who said when there was the creation of Israel, the nation of Israel, that we started the end times. Why? Because the Bible says that the nation of Israel will come back. So I'm not saying that that's what happened. What I'm saying is it's something, it's a reason why the history of the Middle East is something that we just can't stop studying. It's kind of that, I love all history. Don't get me wrong. Love it all. But you just have to love African history to want to study African history. Okay? And I've taught African nationalism, and it's very interesting, and I love teaching class. But there aren't, even in American history. I love American history. Once you get to the progressivism, once you get to modern American history, I'm like, just after Civil War and back. It's the good stuff, right? And the stuff that's okay, well. But even the study of American history, as a red-blooded American as I am, doesn't have these intangibles that kind of go through the consciousness of humanity. And that's why it's so interesting to study the history of the Middle East. There's nothing in the history of the United States that prophesies the end of time. That's a pretty big thing. Okay, so it's one of those intangible things. It's like, that's kind of really neat. I want to study it. Okay? Location. The Middle East, its location has shaped much of the history of mankind. We've talked about this. It's the birthplace of civilizations. The trade routes between Europe post Middle Ages into the Renaissance and over with Marco Polo and the growth of Asia, and when Asia was at its height, these trade routes were a way to share ideas and the growth of who we are today. Okay, we wouldn't have gunpowder and the ability for. You realize if Europe hadn't come into contact with Asia, you wouldn't have had the colonial colossus of the British. Why? Because they got gunpowder and they made it into guns. And then they put it on ships, and they went around the world. Realize this little country right here, tiny Europe, tiny old Britain, dominated most of the world at one point in time. How's that possible? It's technology. That technology was made possible through the trade routes through the Middle East. And some of it was because of their thought of divine sovereignty. They thought, well, we're supposed to take Christianity everywhere, and we're supposed to. All that happened based on what came out of the Middle East. Okay, so trade routes and trade is not just about commerce; it's about ideas. So it's a vital piece to man's history. How will we study the Middle East? Okay, these are the things that we'll study. We will here shortly move into the geography. We'll study it geographically. We'll study the history of pre-Islam, and that's what we'll finish tonight. Okay, so we'll cover those two tonight, geographically and pre-Islam. Then going into next week or two, we'll study the spread of Islam. Okay, we'll talk about worlds colliding with the Crusades through World War II. That's not just Crusades and World War II. Worlds collided. Beginning with the Crusades, and it spans all the way to World War II. Okay? And then we'll talk about some modern issues. We'll talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict. We'll talk about the Cold War. We'll talk about the impact of oil. We'll talk about terrorism. And one that I haven't put on here, we'll talk about the Arab Spring and what's happening in the Middle East right now. And what does that mean for our future. All right, so I'm going to pull up the other PowerPoint. This was what we would have covered if we'd met last week. So I know I went over that pretty quickly. At the same time, all of these stay open, so you can always go back and review them. Okay. I would take. Let's see. I think I put it together in week 1 now. What's in week 1 and week 2, I think is a repeat. So just use what's in week 1 because I put the 2 together here. So just use what's in week 1 and then skip over to week 3. Okay.
Do you open up will you open up week 3 before next Monday? So we can go in there and review?
Yes.
Or he didn't,
Yeah. I opened this up at 5 o'clock, so he printed that out at 5 o'clock. Right?
Prince today.
Yeah. So I opened it just before class. But yes, I'll open it up. Yeah. All right, so what we're going to talk about here is the geography and the rise of civilization. Okay? All right. I need to take a quick phone call. While I do this, what I want you to write for me, and you can turn this in. So get out a piece of paper. I want 5 or 6 sentences. Okay. What prior, and try not to use the stuff that we've already talked about. I did this in my last class. I didn't do it for you, but we'll do it now. And I'll give you a grade for it. Write for me 5 sentences on what you know about the Middle East. What do you know about? I mean, this gives you a little bit about the geography, and I can go back. So, what do you know about the Middle East? Okay, that it's about its geography, and it doesn't have to do with Islam. How about that? May not be much.
Specifically about its geography?
Specifically, but what do you? If someone said to you, "Tell me about the Middle East," in your mind, what's it about?
Okay.
Now. No wrong answer. Okay. You may tell me what I think you're going to tell me and what most people say, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. And then again, tell me about the Middle East in terms of, what else do you know about it? And then, so that's 5 sentences. And then give me a couple sentences of what do you look to learn in this class. So what don't you know? What would you like to learn? Okay. All right. Let me make this quick phone call. And this is honestly because of what's going on today in our town. So it's my wife, so I gotta check in with her, make sure everything's okay.
So we got 5 sentences on what we would say, and then 5 sentences on what we want to learn. So here's a couple of what you want to learn. Okay.
Give you 3 or 4 more minutes. Go ahead. You should put your name at the top. Look. Look. Right. See the pad of my hands already cramping? Okay. When you're done, turn it in. Just take a minute. No wrong answers. Again, this is just to kind of get an idea. Finish whatever sentence you're on. Excellent. All right, so geographically, when you think of the Middle East, what do you think? Not what's up here. These are the 6 areas.
And just like Saudi Arabia, Yemen.
So if you were to talk about these areas, though, what would you describe them as?
The world's leader in like producing oil.
Right, but I'm just talking about the geography. That's what's in the natural resources. When I'm talking geography, I'm talking about what does it look like? The lay of the land.
Dry.
Dry? What else? Mountains?
Desert.
Desert? Okay. And that's what most people think. It's like desert, right? You think of Middle East, you think of what you see in the movies. Desert, oil, mountains. That's it. Okay? Well, that's not an accurate description of the Middle East because yes, there are mountains and this is a large plateau here. But again, there's a reason why this is the birthplace of civilization. Why is it the birthplace? Because you have rivers that flood naturally that created the ability to have agriculture. And progression in agriculture, which then led to the creation of cities, which then led to innovations in writing and all kinds of things that we're going to talk about. So, yes, there are 6 major regions of what's called the Middle East proper, okay? And we'll talk about the Middle East geography. Geographically, this is the Middle East, okay? But we'll also talk about what I call the Greater Middle East, which is the influence of Islam later on. But if you talk about just the 6 areas, you have the Nile River area, okay? You have the Anatolian Plateau, which is Turkey, present-day Turkey, which is Ottoman Empire at one time, okay? You have the Arabian Peninsula, which is a large peninsula, and it's mostly a plateau, okay? And then you have Mesopotamia, which is kind of between the Anatolian Plateau and the Arabian Plateau. And then you have the Zagros Mountains, which are right here, okay? It's kind of protected, as you'll see, and which allows for the growth of civilization. You also have the Eastern Mediterranean, which is this area right on the coast, okay? So there are 2 major civilizations that we're going to talk about here. Okay, you have the Mesopotamian civilizations, the cradle of civilization as it's called frequently, and the Egyptian or the Nile River Delta. Both of these came about because of these rivers and their annual floods. They flooded annually, which means the silt that was in the river laid on top of land, which created good topsoil, which created the ability to farm. So you have the coastal area. Why is the coastal area also a good region for growth?
Fishing.
You have fishing, which is a natural food source, and anytime you have land next to a body of water, you're going to get rain. So this is an area that gets a good bit of rain, so it's not as arid as in the middle of Arabia or in the mountains in the Caucasus, okay? So this is an area that allows for the growth of agriculture because of the rain that comes in from the Mediterranean. So you have natural water sources that lead to the natural growth of food and agriculture. But you also have areas here that naturally have food to grow. Realize it wasn't, man didn't just say, well, I got these seeds, I'm just going to plant them. There were natural wild seeds. There were natural barley and natural wheat and things that they said, well, I can eat this. And if I take the seeds from what grows wild and I put it in this other field where it's not growing wild and it grows the stuff that I can eat, that's the growth of agriculture. Okay, so everything that we found out and what we grow today was found. Okay, and you turned it from wild to cultivated. And then now with modern science, we cross-pollinate and do all kinds of awesome things. Okay, so you got the Fertile Crescent, which is this area right here, which has the kind of the 2 civilizations, the coastal civilizations, and then the ones that came up between the Euphrates and the Tigris River. And then you have the Egyptian, or you have the Nile civilization, which started actually further down and then also came up to the Delta. Okay, so the Nubians were actually down here in the lower part of the Nile, and the Egyptians are from the northern part of the Nile. Okay. All right, so it is a protected cradle. Okay, so if you look at the geography of this area, you have these mountains here that kind of protect. This is modern day Iraq. Okay, modern day Iraq has both the Tigris and Euphrates rivers running through it, and that's why it was a natural place for the growth of civilization, because you didn't have lots of travelers. This is pre-Silk Road. This is pre-wheel. This is caveman type times. Okay, as you had tribal nomadic tribes in this area, they found these rivers and they decided to settle down, and they were able to settle down and actually become a civilization because they were unencumbered. Nobody bothered them. They were kind of protected. You're not going to come from the south, because trying to cross the Arabian Desert, you can do it today. You wouldn't want to do it, pre-camel or really the domestication of the camel. You're just walking across it, you're dead. Okay? So you're protected from the south, and from the north you have all of these mountain ranges that are listed here. We're not going to do a map where you have to list these things. Okay? I just want you to understand what about the geography made this the perfect place for the cradle of civilization. It was really protected from all sides. So the people here could kind of grow technologically and advance without being attacked or invaded or bothered. Really and truly, they grew to the point where they started to bother each other. Now, I don't know what you have. I'm not good with just my little plot of land. I want to be a king, and I want to have a city, and so they started to grow internally. That's when problems started to happen. And then people started to come in, cross and boats and all that kind of stuff. That happened much later, okay? So, but it really was a protected cradle by the geography of the Middle East. Okay, early civilizations, okay, there are three major periods. There's the Neolithic era, the Bronze era, and the Iron era. We'll talk about those more in coming slides. There was the sedentism, which means to become sedentary, meaning to stop moving. Okay, you ever tell you that you've heard that don't have a sedentary lifestyle, don't be a couch potato. Okay, well, before this civilization's cradle of civilization began, nobody was sedentary. Everybody moved. You know why? Because they didn't plant anything. They went wherever the food was. They were nomadic, whether it was in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world. They were nomadic, and so they would just travel to find their food. Okay. Well, the switch from the traveler, the nomad, to farmer, to I'm staying here, the weather's nice, it floods every year, I can grow something, is sedentism, and it is the transition from the nomadic lifestyle to a permanent settlement. Okay? This is what occurs in the Fertile Crescent. Why here? We've talked about it. It had a protected geography. It had a consistent water supply, fresh water. Okay? Mesopotamia itself means land between the lakes. Between the waters. So it's the land between the rivers, which is the Tigris and Euphrates River. Okay? Also, beyond the Mesopotamia, you had the Nile River, which also, in the same fashion, flooded every year. So you could count on good soil every year. And so this led to the domestication of plants and animals. It's really trial and error. Well, what does this grow? We put it in the ground and water to it and whatnot. And if I take these wild cows and put them in a pen, what happens? Well, they make more wild cows. And if I keep feeding them, then more wild cows. No, they're not. Wild cows are just cows. Okay, so the domestication of animals, goats, things like that, and also the constant water supply led to, the growth of civilization. So in the Neolithic period, which is the first period that we talked about, okay, that's the transition from nomad to sedentary people. This is known as the Levant. You've heard of ISIL, okay? ISIL instead of ISIS. Well, ISIL was because they call this area the Levant, okay? It's also known as Nefertiti. But these cultures were loose ties. Basically, these groups grouped together in areas that were habitable, and they just said, well, we're our own little village, but we're not worried about expanding or pushing out into other areas. So each of these were just worried about their own little village. And this is where you have the agricultural revolution. This is where people start to work together to learn how to work the land and get more out of it than just what I need personally. Well, when I start making more out of this land than I need personally, then I start building wealth. When I have wealth, I want to do something with that wealth. And so I start to go to others and say, hey, I've got this extra, I don't have money at this time, but I have this extra grain, and you seem to be able to work with metal. Can I have some of your metal things that you're making here if I give you some of my grain? And that's when commerce starts. And so then you start to barter and trade, and then it goes from that to needing to make actual currency and things like that. So this is how civilization started to begin in these early areas. Each area was kind of starting to be known for making certain things, and they say, well, hey, I know this group up here makes, one thing, and we can't make that down here. We'll travel over here and we'll start with trades. And that's how it all started to come together. And the Bronze Age is when it gets a little more intricate, and it actually becomes more sophisticated. And, this is the really birthplace of large-scale agriculture. It is urbanization. Urbanization is the idea, what it means to be urban. It's urban. Cities, okay? So urban means cities. So urbanization means that you have groups of people who live in a city. Why is that unique? Now, you got to take out the concept of what you understand as a city. We understand Thomasville as a city, okay? And everything has to offer. But back then, to have a city, what does that mean, to have a city? You have many people living in this one spot. What are they not doing for themselves? That they were doing here. What are these people doing that we talked about?
Like going out and trade.
Well, they're trading, but before they trade, they're
Farming.
farming. They're farming specifically for what they need. I'm surviving. Now, you may have chickens and I may have barley, and we live in the same community, and so, but we're all just farming to survive, right? Everybody's got a job, and that job is make food. Maybe make tools to make food, but it's still make food. It's survive, right? When we go from there to here, the people living in these cities, is everybody working to make food? I don't know. Some people are, they're work for the government. Okay, or the kings of these cities, little city-states, or they're priests, or they're merchants, but they just sell things. So the difference, urbanization, when we talk about urbanization, is that you live in a city. Today, it's not a foreign concept. Do you make your own food?
Mm-hmm.
I'd be impressed if you did. I don't. If I need food, I'd go to a store. Let's go buy it. There are no supermarkets here. Now there are trading places, you go buy your food, but the concept of urbanization and on a large scale becomes where you have people who do make food outside the city to take care and grow what's happening inside the city. It is a higher level of man's existence. It's the next rung of civilization. Man has always been able to work together to survive. Even pre-civilization, caveman would travel in packs and work together to hunt and gather and survive and still have kids and things like that, and then take their kids with them. That was still, man's always been able to do that. Since the dawn of time, man's been able to do that. But this is now a concept of, I don't have to go find or make my own food. Somebody else will. I can just go buy it. I can survive without making it on my own. That's the higher rung of civilization. For us, it seems very normal now, obviously. Okay? But back then, that's a quantum leap. You had these Sumerians that owned larger territories. And they owned these larger territories because they made different things. And they said, instead of, well, let's just trade with them, let's take them over. Let's control them so we can just get their stuff, whatever they produced. Okay? Same thing with the Egyptians. You had the pharaohs that come up, and they create this whole hierarchy of the afterlife, and Pharaoh as a god king, and all of this comes about to control this area, control its people, and to have a civilization that had the haves and have-nots, people who work hard and people who take advantage of the ones that work hard or have other means. Okay, so this is where it all begins. Beyond urbanization, then you have writing and trade and learning and religion. Okay, so if you are a caveman and you're hungry, do you have time to try to figure out why the sun rises on one side and goes to the other side? No, of course you don't. Hello? Hey. I made that up. That's fine. Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah, I can be there by 7:30. Okay. I can make it happen. All right. Okay. So because of the protest and everything that's going on downtown, my wife would like me to go get my child from dance. So we're going to wrap this up pretty soon. So we'll pick it up where we need to. We're going to finish this stuff. You have writing and trade. Why do we have writing? Because you got to keep account of what's going on. If I have more stuff, I need to be able to say, well, this is how much stuff I have. And keep account of it. Or I need to be able to communicate between these areas. So you have cities that start to be built, and you have writing, the first form of writing, which is known as cuneiform. Okay? These are things that are start to occur. Of course, you also have the Egyptians who come up with hieroglyphs. Okay, so in the Bronze Age, you have the Akkadians, same area as the Sumerians. They follow the Sumerians. This is considered the first empire. So the Sumerians had city-states. They were all Sumerians, but they only controlled like a little area outside their city. Okay, it was not one Sumerian empire. It was a group of Sumerian city-states. Okay, when the Akkadians come to power, they think, this city-state thing is kind of cool, but I want to be able to control the entire area under one government, under one control. And so they controlled this entire area under one king. Okay. They also constructed roads to make commerce easier. It wasn't the Romans that came up with that, although the Romans perfected it. Okay? The Akkadians actually came up with it or started to do that type of thing. After the Akkadians, you have the Babylonians. You've heard of Hammurabi?
Yes.
Hammurabi's code. This is the beginning of lawmaking. That's a dirty word now. But back then, it was actually a pretty good thing because people were upset with just saying, well, why do we do this? Well, because the king says so. This was the first code that came into place that said, no, A plus B equals C, and that's a law. It doesn't matter who you are, that's a law and you have to abide by it. Okay? So we have speeding laws now because of Hammurabi's code. Because it was the idea that you should come up with a code that makes everybody equal in how we treat one another to a certain degree. Now, granted, back then it was only the males that mattered, okay? And that was just the way things were. But that's the beginning of the concept that we used in the Declaration of Independence that, all men should be created equal, because it should be that there should be this law that's not just because of who your dad was and you won the birth lottery, that your dad was the king of England, that you should be the king. No, what makes you more important than me? That the law should be a law. That's the birthplace of that is Hammurabi's code. This is also the time we had the birthplace of monotheism. Monotheism being the belief in one God, not multiple gods. Prior to this, and then even after this, the idea of religion came from one simple thought. Why? Why does the sun go from one side to the other? Well, obviously it's because Apollo gets in his chariot and he drives the sun across the sky, right? Why does it thunder when it rains? Because Zeus is mad. He's throwing his, thunderbolts, okay? So the concept of religion came from man trying to, and this doesn't discount religion, okay? I'm a religious person. But the idea of religion and why we had polytheism is that in the beginning, man's understanding was if I don't understand it, it must be a God. If I can't control it, it must be a God. And so what you see is you don't see monotheism at the beginning of time. Why? Because at the beginning of time, man didn't understand anything. Didn't understand fire, didn't understand why the grass grew, didn't understand anything. But as it started to cultivate things, now I can control the land. If I plant these things and I can grow wheat, I can kind of control it because occasionally there's a flood that I don't expect and it wipes out my crops. So there must be a God that if I'm not making it happy, the God of agriculture wipes out my crops. But then when they figured out that that's not really what happens, it's something different. There's weather patterns and I can keep that from happening, or it's seasonal. Well, maybe it's not a God. Maybe it's just this is how things work. But I still think that it's amazing that the ground will produce something, so there must be a higher power that controls all of this. And so it becomes the idea of instead of making everything I don't understand a God, it becomes, well, there's one all-powerful God. that defines and the great part of that concept is that if there's one all-powerful God, anything that I learn, even through science, can still be attributed back to, well, there's somebody created this that knows more than I do. And so, really and truly, the idea of a monotheistic or monotheism is, again, kind of like urbanization. It's the next rung in man's understanding and interaction with the world around it. Okay? Where the rub comes is faith, because there's a part that we can never understand. And that is, I mean, I don't think there will ever be a point where man's like, I figured it all out. There is no God. I don't believe in God anymore because now I know everything. So it's just nuts and bolts. I don't know that we'll ever get to that point. Okay? Because there's still things, I mean, you know, even if you think about evolution, people talk about evolution, okay? It's still the concept of, okay, there's everything that you need to start the world. You throw it into a dishwasher or you throw it into a dryer and tumble it enough, it makes something. When you throw all the pieces of a watch into a dryer and you can tumble it for eternity, it's never going to come out of a watch that runs like clockwork. And our universe runs like clockwork. We may figure that out someday. I haven't. I'm not smart enough to. So that's why I'm a religious person, because that's something I can't figure out. You know? But that's what came from this time. Okay? And the Assyrians come after the Babylonians. And then you have the kingdom of Israel. It's about 1,000. You'll see this in your text. Once you get your book, in the first two texts, I will tell you, skim the first chapter. Just geography is the first chapter. Read chapter 2. Okay, that's the pre-Islam chapter. Okay, the history of the history of civilization before Islam. Okay, so read that chapter. But about 1000 BCE is when you had the kingdom of Israel and David, and so that's a true history. In the Bronze Age, also you have the Egyptian Empire. There are 3 sections. You have the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Okay? Each had advancements. We don't have to go through each of these, so you can see them. Okay? So if you just review that, it's in the text as well. Okay. After those, you have the rise of Persia and Greece. And in your text, it's also going to talk about the Romans, and it's also going to talk about kind of the Arabs. So I want you to focus on that. What I will do is I'm going to post an assignment in week 2. It's either going to be in week 2 or week 3. I may just go ahead and open up week 3 and put it in week 3 because you're going to be focused on week 3. So I'll do that. I'll put it in week 3. But, so I asked you a couple questions. So make sure you read chapter 2. Some questions will come from it. Okay? And it'll be about the part that's not covered here, which is kind of the Romans forward. This ends in the Greeks. So you have the Persians, and the Persians make the greatest empire known to man at one point in time. Okay, Cyrus the Great conquers the Babylonians, and he creates the Persian Empire. And he controls most of the Middle East. It's an Aramaic, and this is where we get the Arabic languages. It's from the Persian Empire. Iran harkens back to the Persians. They call themselves Persians. Okay. So that's kind of their historical base. But then you have this guy, Alexander the Great, comes up and he smashes the Persian Empire, which is amazing because Macedonia is this little kingdom that's right above Greece. Then he comes in and with the Greek phalanx, which harkens to the Romans use it later on, and heavy armor, he is able to absolutely, in the use of cavalry, he crushes the Persians, and he controls the known world by the age of 33. Then he dies. And once he dies, his generals split it up, and this is what you see here is the split kingdoms of actually Alexander the Great's empire. Okay, from there, then you have again the slow dying of the Romans. He talks about the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. And what you have is this interesting dynamic, and this is probably where the questioning is going to come in a bit. You have this interesting dynamic of what grows out of the Arabian Peninsula because of these two empires. They're too busy fighting each other, and it kind of shapes the birth of modern Middle East. It shapes the birth of Islam. Okay? It comes from here, Mecca and Medina, and this area, and it almost is, in a way, a reaction to these two empires fighting each other. Okay? And then they're slowly dying. They kind of kill each other off. They weaken each other to the point that they can't survive. Okay? So, read chapter 2. There will be an assignment in chapter 3. Again, everybody knows which book to get. Sorry they had the wrong one. Do you understand that? I've used this now since 2014. So, we will not read this entire book. It's kind of snippets out of it, certain chapters, certain things. But again, it's not a bad read. And I will post these as a grade. Thanks for coming. One last thing, stay away from downtown.